Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and as the co-chair of the CSIS recommendations effort for the next president, I just want, while I'm in this forum, to thank them for the effort that they are putting into that and for the breadth of their reach to try to make sure we have really good, consolidated, usable recommendations. Some of the recommendations that I'm going to share with you today are ones that I've also made in that forum. We're here because the world has changed so dramatically. Over the past 25 years, the internet age has transformed our economy and shrunk the world in ways that few could have foreseen. The technological revolution that made working across borders so effortless is easy to forget that before, things looked very, very different to us. In the early 1990s, if you wanted to call other countries, you'd have to use your landline telephone, and it was several dollars per minute. I can remember what an important thing it was when I was a child that the phone rang and it was long distance. Everybody had to drop what they were doing and hurry to get the long distance call. Today, anyone with a Wi-Fi connection and a smartphone can initiate a video conference of unlimited duration with 9 other parties located anywhere in the world, total cost free. In the early 1990s, cell phones were still a luxury item possessed by fewer than 20 million people worldwide. In the early days, you had to carry them in your briefcase. Today, there are more than 7 billion mobile devices in use, more devices than people on the planet, and you can fit them in any pocket. In the early 1990s, those who wished to transfer money overseas would have to drive to a bank or to a money transfer service, complete the required paperwork, show identification, pay a substantial fee. Today, money can be transferred for free to any Bitcoin wallet or PayPal account in the world using an app on a smartphone, all of which makes the world a very different place. The unbounded nature of the internet has diminished the importance of international borders, and while this new open marketplace has many benefits, it also has costs. Among them, that it enables criminals from around the world to target American citizens in ways never before possible. You don't have to go overseas to become their target. It is now routine for cyber criminals based in Russia, Ukraine, Romania, West Africa, and other cybercrime hotspots to leverage the power of the internet to steal from Americans here at home. Indeed, the market to defraud Americans has grown so competitive that American cybercriminals are falling behind. These days, most sophisticated cyber schemes originate overseas. In just the past 7 months, there have been 3 game-changing cyber incidents illustrating a new danger in this increasingly interconnected world. December, hackers believed to be based in Russia carried out an unprecedented attack on the power grid in western Ukraine. In the dead of winter, cyber attackers were able to infiltrate computers within electric distribution facilities and cut power to roughly 30 Ukrainian substations, plunging nearly 250,000 people into winter darkness. To cover their tracks and make the damage more difficult to repair, the attackers then disabled the computers they had infiltrated by overwriting the operating software. And in their final act, the attackers disconnected the emergency power servicing the power distribution centers, forcing the Ukrainian operators attempting to repair the damaged systems to work in the dark. It's tempting to conclude that our superior American technology would have fended off such an attack, but there's little evidence to support that view. It has been reported that the targeted Ukrainian facilities were better defended against cyber attack than some equivalent facilities in the US. Even more troubling, experts believe that the attack would have been harder to mitigate in the United States, where we have moved beyond the analog era manual backup switches that helped operators restore power in the Ukraine incident. The second game-changing incident was the Department of Justice indictment charging 7 agents of the Iranian government with a series of sophisticated cyber attacks against the United States. The indictment charges the Iranian defendants with using zombie networks of compromised computers, botnets, to target the U.S. financial system. Allegedly, they attacked 46 different financial institutions by flooding their computer servers with data. The attacks cost tens of millions of dollars to remediate and caused hundreds of thousands of customers to lose online access to their financial accounts. One of the Iranian operatives charged in the indictment is also alleged to have hacked into the control system for the Bowman Dam in Rye, New York, and gained full control over the dam's operations. He would have been able to open the dam's sluice gate and release stored water had the dam not been under maintenance at the time of the attack. The final of these three warning shots came in the first months of this year when more than a dozen American hospitals were infected with ransomware, a malicious software popular with Eastern European cybercriminals. Ransomware infects computers silently, encrypts files using an unbreakable algorithm, and then demands a ransom in order to return the encrypted data to a readable state. The ransom varies, but is often tens of thousands of dollars. Ransomware is a nuisance threat to any computer, but when it infects critical infrastructure like a hospital, the results are potentially devastating in the physical universe. When the MedStar Consortium of Hospitals was struck with ransomware last month, doctors lost access to patient records, so scheduled surgeries were delayed or canceled. As we expand our reliance on electronic health records, which, by the way, is a very good thing to do, these consequences will only worsen. This all should make it abundantly clear that we need to harden our cyber defenses. Congress can't solve this problem alone, but there are common sense reforms Congress can implement to mitigate the cyber threat. A good first step would be to enact legislation that powers up our cyber prosecutors and investigators for this new era. Together with Senator Lindsey Graham, I've proposed legislation to create a new federal offense for hacking critical infrastructure with more significant penalties. It would also create a new offense for trafficking in botnets. Buying and selling botnet access is a new criminal trade. And it would expand the Department of Justice's authority to seek injunctions to shut down botnets. Excuse me one second. I'm also working to prevent poorly written cross-border data legislation from advancing in Congress. Now is not the time to erect new barriers that will make it even harder for U.S. law enforcement to find foreign cyber criminals. Proposals that would prohibit U.S. law enforcement from using search warrants to gather evidence about foreign cyber criminals and instead compel the use of the glacial mutual legal assistance treaty process would make the cybercrime problem worse. Equally troubling is the idea that we should give foreign nations, including Russia, the discretion to veto search warrant applications that seek evidence about foreign cybercriminals. These proposals empower foreign cybercriminals and should be reconsidered. To better protect our federal networks against cyber attacks, I believe it's time to set up a roving Inspector General for Cybersecurity with responsibility across the civilian agencies. A single specialized office dedicated to federal cybersecurity with authority to do white hat tests of agency security could attract world-class talent and would spur federal agencies to keep pace in the cyber arms race against hackers. Currently, this responsibility is spread across 73 inspectors general throughout the federal government with predictable results. The public has a poor understanding of the scope and severity of the cyber threat. Not a good situation in a democracy. Part of the problem is a culture of overclassification that pervades the executive branch. Too often, information about cyber attacks targeting our country is reflexively classified, which denies the public an adequate awareness of the threats we face. And declassification is at best an arduous process. Of course, on the private side, companies never want to talk about being hacked. The result is a public in the dark. We need a good storyteller for cyber if our democracy is to function with the right degree of attention to this problem. The president should create an office, probably at the White House, charged with clearly and concisely reporting to the American people the actual state of the intrusions and threats we face, and empower this office to declassify information that would contribute to the public's understanding of the cyber threat. The report should, of course, anonymize individual targets where appropriate, and of course must not release information that would imperil ongoing national security or law enforcement efforts. Another communications move for the executive branch would be to communicate more clearly to the world the consequences for nations that sponsor cyber attacks against American businesses and government. I've applauded the Department of Justice's efforts to publicly indict foreign agents for cyber attacks, and I encourage the department to keep going. But we can, with a coalition of willing allies, develop international cyber norms, a coalition of the willing, that set expectations and empower deterrence in cyberspace. Countries that sponsor cyber attacks against U.S. interests, or who assist, license, or shelter those who conduct such attacks, should be put on notice that there will be consequences for such actions. In the Cold War, we didn't negotiate our deterrence policy with our atomic adversaries, and we don't need our cyber adversaries to sign off on deterrence policy now. I also recommend that we take another look at the old-fashioned militia model that lets ordinary citizens come to their country's aid. This could be through the traditional National Guard. Rhode Island, for instance, has an Air Guard cyber wing that we're very proud of. But it could also be separate, because in this theater of operations, it really doesn't matter how someone's hair is cut, or whether they can't or just won't do push-ups for you, or if they like to sleep in until noon. A cyber militia is worth exploring. The final piece I'll discuss with you is the private sector, which has immense knowledge and skill that helps defend our private and government networks. The private sector manages and has a duty to protect our critical infrastructure, like our financial networks and power grid. We need to take robust advantage of the private sector's talents and also make sure that those who operate our critical infrastructure are not slacking or free-riding in meeting their cyber defense responsibilities. Part of that equation will be stress testing the NIST cybersecurity framework effort to make sure it is actually producing adequate security for critical infrastructure in key industries, rather than just happy participants because they're asked to do so little. We must also consider proposals to permit the private sector to engage in active defense of its own networks. Private defense would need to be closely coordinated with law enforcement and military actors. But in the spirit of letters of marque to the old privateers, it is time for us to consider whether, how, and with whose permission we should allow private entities some licensed scope to defend themselves. Many of us in Congress are very concerned about cybersecurity, and we will continue to work to strengthen our laws and better protect our nation against cyber attacks. Particularly, we want prosecutors to have tools tailored to the new world of cybercrime they face. It has been a pleasure to share with you these thoughts today about these important issues, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Senator Whitehouse has agreed to take questions, and we have about 15 minutes to do so. So same format as we've used for panels. If you'd please raise your hand, we'll call on you, and a mic will be brought to you. We have one right in the middle.
Hi, Senator. Sean Lingus with FCW. Your last point about limited license to defend for private companies, can you clarify just how far up to the threshold of hacking back you're proposing? Because it sounds like you're...
I'm not proposing anything except that we have a thoughtful conversation about how that should take place. I don't think there's even a proper forum in government where a company that wants to go to say, look, this is what we want to do to defend ourselves, can go and get an answer. We've basically said that's not a question we're going to take up, and that makes the answer effectively no to everyone. I think there should be a process for considering it. If the answer remains no, okay, the answer remains no. I don't know enough about it to be able to predict where that conversation leads, but I do think that there's enough expertise in the private sector and there's enough of an attack against the private sector that it is reasonable to predict that we could develop certain norms that would allow particular companies the authority to take specific steps to defend themselves, again, with advance permission from, we don't even know now from whom, but from somebody in the government who would give them that authority, whether it's FBI or NSA or DHS or the military.
We have one in the back over here.
Hi, yes, thank you very much for your comments. I'm curious, kind of speaking about some of these private companies and even other transnational actors, because of the nature of cybersecurity and cyber data often transcends borders. What role do you see the U.S. working with, say private companies when you have multiple countries' privacy laws at play there? How does that work itself out?
Usually through the courts. And it has for the entire history of the Republic. If you want a search warrant, you have to go to a judge to get it. If you want a court to issue a subpoena, even if you've gotten the subpoena signed, they can come back and say, no, we challenge the subpoena, it's overbroad, we're not going to comply with it. The judicial branch of government has always been the prime forum for arbitrating those concerns. So I don't see any reason to have the judicial branch not be a really significant element in finding these answers. It's a complicated mess. Speaking as a member of Congress, it's a complicated mess. We don't do complicated all that well. Nuance is not Congress's most renowned feature. Very powerful interests are in play that have very specific goals that they wish to achieve that are not necessarily consistent with the public interest. We're not particularly good at arbitrating those either. So I think that letting this develop in the courts is a perfectly natural and sensible way to go. Where you run afoul of that theory of mine is now that it's an international environment and you have potentially conflicting court determinations in different jurisdictions, and a company is now making decisions about which decision it wants to subject itself to. There are very good reasons for not wanting to subject yourself to the justice system in Azerbaijan compared to the justice system in the United States. And so, you know, you get into that quirk of the lack of consistency of the element of justice in the justice systems across a whole variety of different countries. And that does complicate things. But I think the baseline remains, you know, even in that, choice of laws is not a complicated, this is a new application, but choice of laws and choice of jurisdiction is something that courts fight about all the time. And so I think there are times when something is complicated, it's not bad to refer it to as Bryce, who wrote The American Commonwealth years ago, sort of the Brit sequel to de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, that it's our particular genius to send difficult questions sometimes to the cool, dry atmosphere of judicial determination.
We have a question on this side of the room.
Thank you. My name is Lucy Thompson. I'm a former Justice Department federal prosecutor, and I'm a security expert now. And thank you for the thoughtful suggestions that you're going to send to the White House. Have you considered constructing legislation that would actually deal with the Internet of Things and the other kinds of vulnerabilities in the industrial control system involving known vulnerabilities, and to actually state in legislation that organizations shouldn't use hardware or software or techniques with known vulnerabilities? Because that's the heart of the problem. All these attack vectors are published and known, but companies just continue to manufacture and use them.
The short answer to your question is not precisely. I led the Democratic side in the efforts a few years back to come up with an overarching bipartisan cyber bill, and we actually got pretty darn close. And one of the key elements was focusing on critical infrastructure. And I still think that remains the critical focus. That could be because you've jumped from pure cyber world into the real world. You have been able to spin up a pump at a chemical plant so that the chemical plant has an explosion and a fire, and there's all sorts of physical trauma and casualties that result. But it could also be that people lose confidence in the banking system because they're not confident that the hackers aren't into their accounts, and by God, they're going to get it out. And like the boy with tuppence at the Bank of England, you know, it starts a run on the bank even though there's actually no physical leap. And I'd be equally concerned about both of those because I think a full-on flight for the banks with everybody trying to get their money out in a cyber panic would be pretty devastating. So any advice you have for us on how to address critical infrastructure, I would take. Again, we came, I thought, very close and had a fairly sound framework of a program together. When that failed legislatively, the administration went ahead and created the NIST framework process. I have not seen anybody who's taken a really deep dive into the results of the NIST framework process. I do get reports that everybody's happy. And the reason that I want the stress test is that there are two ways in which people get happy in a process that they're participating in. One is because it's really being productive and it's really getting the job done even if they're being asked to do a lot. And the other is because they're perfectly comfortable because no big asks are being made of them and it's, you know, the status quo continues to be able to be pursued without too much disturbance. If it's the latter, we have a problem on our hands, because we frankly do need to solve the problem of defending critical infrastructure. And a stress test of whether the NIST framework is actually doing that, I think, would be a worthy effort for the new president.
Here in the middle.
Sir Ed Gibson, rather than enact more legislation, and I fully understand why things were done post 9/11, for example, the creation of ODNI and Department of Homeland Security, and more recently, the recommendation that we have commercial fusion cells. So since 9/11, we've actually created more entities that are in fact supposed to be the direct line communication for all cyber matters, but I'm convinced unless cybersecurity is made a cabinet level position, nothing's really going to change. We have a cybersecurity czar at the White House, so what? We have DHS promulgating, so what? It's just not going to happen.
You are right to point out that there is an executive function that is required here in order to bring together some very disparate agencies. It's hard to unify a single cabinet position that can cover everything that the DHS does, and everything that the NSA does, and everything the Department of Justice does, and so forth. So I'm not sure that a cabinet position actually works. I think you've got to have a body that can leap the cabinet frame and own responsibility for elements of that. The roving inspector general for cyber would be a kind of a test proposition of that. That's something that the president could set up by executive order. They could have him located at OMB, for instance. They could hire people to hack in and say, are these guys good or are they not, and go around actually testing the proposition. You also want to be very, very careful about touching on anything having to do with either NSA or military or intelligence being deployed in the country. That's a barrier that has very, very significant protections around it for good reason. So I agree with you fully. It's not as easy a problem to solve as to, I think, create a cabinet position might suggest. I think that doesn't quite do the trick. But I do think that there needs to be accountability in this area, and there's not enough. And it's one of the reasons that I think my colleague in the House, who's very expert in this area, Jim Langevin, has been such a determined advocate for there to be a much more empowered cyber czar who could demonstrate power in the way that Washington cares about it, which is budgets, hiring and firing, and got to get through them to get the president's ear. If you can't show those things, which the current cyber czar has zero of, then everybody learns very quickly that unless you're like some kind of special best friend who has privileged access, you got a nice title, buddy, but you don't count.
We did promise to get the senator out on time, so I think we have only time for one more question, if we do have one more. One on this side of the room.
Senator, you spoke about warrants and the role of the judiciary and also equipping prosecutors with tools. Could you comment on the proposed amendments to Rule 41?
Remind me.
The amendment would allow magistrate judges to issue warrants where...
Oh, yeah.
Yep, okay.
Yeah. I'm actually, I think that they could probably be winnowed down a little bit in the process of negotiation. But I think generally the idea that in this world where it's very hard to actually locate something, you have to get separate warrants and separate magistrates to sign separate documents in separate locations is an exercise of form over substance. It doesn't really enhance anybody's privacy interests. It just makes it more work to do the thing that needs to be accomplished. And what people often overlook is that thing that needs to be accomplished sometimes has life or death consequences in real time. And so to add a lot of burden to it, I'm not saying that I'm going to sign on to the department's proposal verbatim as it's written, but I do think that it's a step in the right direction. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the conversation that CSIS is leading on this and that CSIS is having. We need to get this right.
Senator does have to leave us, but we now have our summary of today's events from the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General, David Bitkower. Please welcome David Bitkower.
Thanks, Mick, and I will try not to make this a summary of an all-day event because it would take another whole day, but I did want to start by, first of all, thanks, Mick, but thanks to CSIS and their very generous partnership and support in putting on this great event. Thanks also to all the participants who took part, starting with Senator Whitehouse. We really appreciate your remarks and your attention to these issues and, frankly, your leadership on them over a long period of time. Thanks to the participants from academia, whose job it is to think hard about these things and ask more questions than we can answer. To our participants, obviously, from DOJ, the State Department, foreign liaisons and partners who we work with in lots of contexts, and, of course, our friends from industry. I also want to say, just one process point before I make a couple of concluding remarks, is from DOJ's perspective, I think it's a real pleasure of ours to be able to engage with folks in this kind of forum. I think one thing most people don't understand who haven't been in the department is that these are issues we think about on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour, sometimes minute-by-minute basis. Before I had this particular position, I had a position where I had the opportunity to work on basically a daily basis with the folks in the computer crime and intellectual property section. And we would regularly sit down and meet and think about cases and issues And often part of the pleasure of that job was to hear them toss around, from the US government perspective, all of the same issues we're talking about today. That is, how does this particular enforcement step affect privacy? How does it affect foreign comedy? How does it affect the world going forward? Would we apply this same step in another context in another day? These are the issues that people across the department think about to a greater degree than I think most people appreciate. And you got a chance to see some of that, I think, on display on these panels, and that's the same exact kind of conversations that take place in our department, and I know frankly, across the entire US government as well. So it's our pleasure to share that with you guys. There's a couple of just sort of concluding, not really more questions, frankly, than remarks, because I'm not going to even try to summarize all the great insights that our panelists made, but I think the comments across the four panels really do raise some questions that are probably worth further thinking until we hopefully meet again next year as well. So the first one that I think was raised by all four panels, frankly, is what is the right frame of analysis for these questions? That is, we typically think about them as Americans, those of us who are American, of course. And when we talk about how they affect our foreign partners and how we live in an international world, we often fall into the trap thinking solely about our close cross-Atlantic partners, frankly. But one of the lessons I think of today's sessions is that how do we think about these issues in the context of the entire world? That is, the actions that we take here as a government, the actions that our companies take here, of course, have impacts and ripples throughout the world. And when we talk about policy solutions to these different problems, there may be one solution that makes sense for America if it were alone in the world, another one that makes sense for America in the context of its close allies in combating terrorism, in combating other threats to public safety, in combating threats to cybersecurity. And there may be a third approach if we pull back to an even larger framework. And we're not going to solve all those problems at once, so we can't not act simply because we can't solve all of the problems of the entire world, but we have to be aware of those different frames when we think about them. Different problems obviously affect different countries differently. Different countries have different capabilities, as we just heard on the encryption panel, and we have to think about our solutions in light of what those capabilities are, and different countries face different threats. The United States, I think, faces among the greatest, if not obviously the greatest threats of any country, but that doesn't mean we're the only ones who face these threats, and given the capabilities, those threats play out differently. And then when we think about solutions, another question that we can ask is, we can think about a policy proposal that the US might come up with and ask how that policy proposal affects our companies as they do business in other countries, and it affects other countries as they try to enforce their own laws and protect their own citizens. And that might recommend one answer. But if we think about not taking a certain policy step and another country going first, that might raise a different set of questions and set of answers. And if we think about the role the US has historically played in the privacy context, in the law enforcement context, in striking balances and setting models for other countries in the world, that's another consideration, I think, that is raised by some of the various complex issues we've discussed today. Second question I think that's raised is, what does the future hold here? Easy to think about it in the sense of, are things getting better or worse? But that begs a whole lot of questions that obviously we can't answer. But how are the different changes that are taking place affect different stakeholders here and abroad? Are there natural limits to some of the changes that we're seeing today? Are there natural limits to the degree to which providers will encrypt communication such that they can't be accessed by governments? We've certainly seen folks mention that there are limits to the steps that providers want to take because of their own business models. Are there natural limits to what providers or other communications manufacturers, for example, do in terms of moving data around? So one possibility is that data gets more and more dispersed in a variety of jurisdictions. The other possibility is, of course, that data gets concentrated in certain jurisdictions that are friendlier. Are there natural limits that are inherent in countries' natural interest in protecting themselves and their citizens and other interests that those countries have? So we heard that there are 100 million consumers in Brazil of certain telecommunications providers and hundreds of millions of citizens in other countries who are those consumers. Are there natural limits on what we can expect other countries to do as they catch up with the threats and develop their own policy solutions? And if there are natural limits, what does that mean in terms of the cybersecurity arguments that we hear? What does it mean in terms of the public safety arguments that we hear? These are things we think about what the future holds. I think there's a consensus. There was certainly a consensus today, I think, maybe not that things are getting better or worse, but that they are changing more and more quickly, that the problems are getting harder, or at least not easier, and they're certainly getting more complex, and which certainly bodes well for future panels and conferences to talk about those problems, particularly from our academic friends who love those issues. And then finally, The last question I think that is prompted by all of the panels we heard today are who ultimately are the decision makers on these issues? In a world where technology is changing more and more quickly and problems are becoming more and more complex and effects are felt over different societies in different ways, how likely is it that doing nothing is the best we can do? And so I would suggest that in that sort of world, we demand policy solutions to complex problems, and it is less and less likely that whatever the market happens to give us is the best we can do. That segues very naturally into the question of what is the role of the private sector, which came up again on, I think, just about every panel here, and just about every speaker touched on it. We inarguably live in a world of multiple stakeholders, billions of them, in fact, hundreds of millions right here in the United States. How do we fashion solutions that respect all the different stakeholders and all the different stakes in a way that doesn't let one particular stake overwhelm all of the others? And I don't mean to be sort of secretly calling out the private sector as that one. I think that question can be asked in a variety of contexts. That is, do we let one country exercise veto power over what another country does? And if so, in what contexts? I think I'll just harken back initially to the comments that Assistant Attorney General Caldwell made when she opened this conference this morning, which is, how do we just balance those stakes? Don't let one factor overwhelm all of the others, and make sure at the end of the day that we have policy solutions to policy problems, no matter how complex. We don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because I think it's inarguable there will be no perfect solution to any of the problems we discussed today, but also to bear in mind at all times, I think, that doing nothing is itself a choice, and it's a choice that has impacts on certain proportions of the people and certain populations, and we can't forget that fact either. So with those three questions, which I hope we'll all have answers to by tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., you can turn your papers in over here. I want to thank everybody for coming. Thanks to CSIS again and to CSIPS for organizing this, and thanks to all our participants. So thank you very much.